Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sacred Matrix on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. And I'm your host, Janet Kier Lesson, with my co-host, Dr. Sasha Lesson. And today we're going to talk about Andy 2016, A Time for Truth, the presidential campaign of Andrew-d-Basiago. And he is here with Alfred Webre. And this is a show that's going to rock the world. Sash, what would you like to say?
This is our chance to get rid of the matrix and find out what's really going on, and Andy's the guy that can do it.
Thank you. So let's begin with, Alfred. Let's start with you, Alfred. Tell us a little bit about your role in this unveiling of the campaign, Andy2016.com. Welcome to our show. Tell us about yourself and your part.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And yes, I think that this is a very people who are tuned in may really understand that this is a breakthrough campaign, because it's the first publicly identified time travel pre-identified U.S. presidential campaign in history. Am I correct, Andy?
Yes, it's certainly the first to be publicly identified as resulting from prior identification by the U.S. intelligence community. Other previous presidents, going back to President Carter, I know were identified. I don't know about Ford and Reagan, but I know that Presidents Carter, George H.W. Bush, Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama were pre-identified by the U.S. intelligence community as a result of the development of a quantum access capability in the CIA, resulting from the time travel advances of DARPA in the early 70s, so that one of the complications of the modern presidency has been the recent ones have known at the time that they announced, in fact, decades in some cases before they announced for president, that they were the winner of the presidency, at least at some time in their career, they were destined to win the presidency. What distinguishes my campaign is I'm the first of the post-1970 pre-identified presidential candidates who has simultaneously informed the American people that this has happened, and that decades ago I was informed of my ultimate presidency, not just the fact that I would run.
Well, I'd like to read something. I just want to take a little break here and read this. Andrew-d-Basiago, One Man in the Name of Truth. Andrew-d-Basiago is a prominent figure in the truth movement. For more than 10 years, he has shared with the American people the true facts of our great nation's accomplishments in time travel and Mars visitation. He has done so as one who served bravely in the 2 secret U.S. defense projects in which time travel on Earth and voyages to Mars were first undertaken. As a result of his courageous advocacy as a crusading lawyer, Andy is credited with ending the time travel Mars cover-ups by the U.S. government on behalf of the American people. This arduous work in the vineyards of the truth movement represented historic breakthroughs in America's understanding of our past and our prospects for the future. Today, Andrew-d-Basiago is running for President of the United States with a new agenda for a new America. He has vowed that if elected president, he will lead the American people into a bold new era of truth, reform, and innovation as great as they are great. Okay, join us in supporting Andy in his quest to establish a presidency as honest, just, and ingenious as the American people. Andy 2016, now is the time. So, and then you did an announcement on Coast to Coast AM. I'm not sure the date that was. Was that
actually,
a couple weeks ago?
Yeah, that goes to where my campaign is today. I first stated that I was planning on running in 2016 on the November 10th, 2011 broadcast of Coast to Coast AM, which was the broadcast that I brought on as fellow guests my fellow Mars jumper William Stillings and Laura Eisenhower, our dear friend who was subjected to a recruitment effort in 2006 and 7 to literally resettle on the Red Planet at our colony there with her two twin boys, Gavin and Garrick Eisenhower. And so that was an historic broadcast because that was the first time that two U.S. chrononauts had ever appeared in the mainstream media together. That was Brett and I. And then also that was the first time that a member of a U.S. presidential family gave personal testimony about the existence of the secret space program. Indeed, the great-granddaughter of the very President Dwight David Eisenhower, who was so involved with the extraterrestrial question. And Laura's also assisted us in bringing a lot of that information forward, the legacy of the Eisenhower administration's interaction with extraterrestrials. So I was asked on that show in light of the fact that part of the story was that I had been pre-identified and informed of my presidency in summer of 1980 when I was in training to go to Mars, whether I planned to run. And I stated not in 2012, but that I would be a candidate in 2016. So I've gradually been developing a Facebook group and gradually, slowly doing interviews, most of them on radio, regarding my platform and so forth. But what has now happened and where I am in the campaign is that on December 19th, I announced my candidacy very informally on Coast to Coast AM. And I did that because I think a lot of the vainglorious tradition of American politics is somewhat of an anachronism. We're sort of more in a cool rather than a hot area of media where people really want to know what you're going to try to accomplish rather than be bamboozled by your oratory. So I decided to do a kind of a laid-back announcement on Coast to Coast AM with Jimmy Church, the guest host, substituting for George Norrie. George had originally asked me to agree to do the first interview as a declared candidate with him on Coast, but then, we know that George became a candidate himself there for a period of time. He was considering running. He was certainly being urged by others to run, and then decided that it really wasn't something that he wanted to do. So then they went ahead with my appearance, and I did it on Coast also, quite frankly, because Coast reaches 600 radio stations. People have been saying to me, well, I never see you in the mainstream media. You're not in the debates. How can I regard you as a serious candidate? My response to that is, wait a minute. Of the 1,100 or more officially registered candidates, those who have filed with the Federal Election Commission, I announced to the largest media audience of any of them. I mean, Coast gets the largest audience of any TV or radio program in its time slot, which is the prime time slot. So while it may be true that they focused on the 19 establishment candidates, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders running for the Democratic nomination, and then Bush and Trump and Pataki and the rest running for the Republican nomination, none of them got as large of an audience because I was announcing on Coast. So they may not be talking about me on the CBS Evening News. Look at what Trump's money has purchased. He's gotten, he got 81 minutes on CNN, whereas Bernie Sanders got a minute. Okay. So a lot of that mainstream media coverage is actually being purchased primarily by Mr. Trump. But the bottom line is that I actually announced to more live listeners or viewers than any of the other 1,100 people in the race. And so I'm a serious candidate, and where I'm now is I'm going to be drafting my 100 proposals that'll make up my platform, publishing them on my website at andy2016.com, and then periodically posting the individual proposals via social media, especially Facebook and Twitter. We know that 1,000 Twitter receipts of a particular tweet may result in several 100,000 people ultimately reading that tweet because of the way that Twitter is structured. So I'm running, admittedly, a virtual campaign in the sense that I'm intentionally going to be running an internet-based campaign with a focus on getting a clear, visionary message out to the American people and not going around the country vaingloriously stumping for the position, which is the tradition. The other thing I did, though, to adhere to the tradition of running for president is I announced at an appropriate time. The other candidates announced way too early. It's the tradition to announce about a year before the general election. For example, Robert F. Kennedy declared on March 16th of 1968. Of course, that was controlled by what Lyndon Johnson was going to be doing, and then when Johnson declared he wasn't going to be a candidate in November of 68, then Bobby ran. But let's look at two more sort of political candidates rather than idealistic candidates, Ronald Reagan and William Jefferson Clinton. Ronald Wilson Reagan declared for the presidency in November of 1979, a year before the general election of November of 1980. And William Jefferson Clinton declared, I went back and found this precise date, which I had recalled because I actually left Portland, Oregon to return to L.A. to take the California bar exam. Clinton declared the day I left my law school town there of October 9th of 1991 for the November 1992 election. So what we've seen from these 19 declared candidates is all of the egotism and the vainglory of declaring, in the case of some of them, almost 2 years in advance, and showing that little respect for the sitting president and for our public and institutions of government in not allowing electioneering to color the third year of the previous president's last 4 years in office. And I find that highly objectionable, and I'm proud that I exercised the discipline and the lack of egoic projection, and I allowed myself to be governed by the traditions of our country rather than egotism and self-aggrandizement by declaring 2 years, a year and a half, 15 months before the general election, just because it was the thing that was strategically advantageous to do.
And now they're doing all these debates, and they've been going on for quite a while. When did they start? Does anybody remember what the first debate was? Televised debate? This in 2015? I don't know what month it was.
It was well before November. It was like August or something. And many of them had been running since the spring. I think Hillary was one of the first to declare, look, this is outside of our tradition as a country. And I'm sorry to say, as a trailing edge boomer, according to Strauss and Howe, the baby boom was from 1943 to 1961. So that would put Lady Di and Barack Obama and George Stephanopoulos and Wayne Gretzky and I at the tail end of the baby boom. And I've lived my whole life to some extent in the shadow of the boom. And I really have to call all of the first wave boomers in this presidential race on their egotism, their egocentricity, and their self-aggrandizement. We can't change the abiding traditions of the country just because they want to be president. Most of them declared a year and a half before the general election. And I'm sorry, our country has never permitted our existing functioning of government to be influenced in that way by electioneering. If look at the logical extension of that. If we allowed the Hillary Rodham Clintons of the world to declare 2 years in advance, half of the last term of the lame duck president would be dedicated towards electioneering. I would like to submit that there was some wisdom to what the great leaders of, let's just even say, the greatest generation, the Henry Jacksons and the Mac Mathiases and the Hubert Humphreys and the John F. Kennedys, they would never have declared so early in assertion of their desire to be president and in contravention.
Well, I was looking at your list of questions here, and oh, sorry, we're breaking up.
I can hear you perfectly, Janet.
Okay, sorry, you're breaking in and out. Okay, I'm sorry I interrupted. Go ahead and finish your thought.
No, it's just that, look, I've tolerated this for certainly my entire adult life. The first wave boomers were the people who just had to show up and they received employment. The Obamas and the Basiagos had to apply for 100 jobs to maybe have a shot at one because we were at the end of the boom, and the positions that had been filled in society were filled by first wave boomers. I think this has been the height of conceit by the baby boom to believe that just because they desire to be president, that they should be able to contravene the abiding customary practice of our political culture of declaring about a year in advance, not a year and a half, not 2 years in advance. And I was just drawing the analogy to the great political leadership of the greatest generation. They never would have done this. Could you see John Fitzgerald Kennedy declaring for president in November of 1959? Please, or not 1959, November of 1958. It just would not have been thought of. But because of that propensity of the boomers to ask what's in self-interest first and in the interest of the country second or not at all, I just have to point up the fact that the whole time I was being pressured on Facebook to declare, as if I was being accused of being a non-candidate and so forth, I was actually trying to respect the traditions of the country, and I was always planning on declaring. I had actually said to many of my followers on Facebook that I was going to declare in November. November came and went, but then I declared in December, 11 months before the general election. I would just like to be credited for that because I was able to resist the selfish impulse to declare, but I must say that some of my older brethren in the baby boom were not able to control their impulses, their self-aggrandizement, their egocentricity, and they declared far too early, and they're going to pay a heavy price for it.
Okay. Sasha has a question.
Yes.
What would the candor about the U.S. jump room program and time travel program and the implementation of the transfer of technology, medical technology from the ETs, what kind of effect would that have if you were president and could really get a Congress behind you to pass legislation empowering candor?
Well, I don't think we're going to need, in most cases, congressional action, because the president, under our system of government, can issue executive orders if those orders order executive branch agencies to do or not do things. So most of the secrets that could advantage our lives, the teleportation technology, the suppressed medical evidence, the free energy technology, just to cite three leading examples, are held by U.S. government agencies operating on the basis of official state secrecy, and actually propping up obsolete industries and actually dooming people to fates from, for example, cancers that have already been cured as a result of viewing some technologies that the government itself has developed as disruptive and therefore keeping them enshrouded for decades in red tape and in official state secrecy. I have vowed that if elected president, I'm going to administer a truth presidency, which means I'm going to implement a specific truth policy. And that policy is based on my belief that there's only two bases by which state secrets should be kept. One is if the release of that information would present a clear and present danger. For example, a clear and present danger of an atomic explosion by people outside the government in some way. Or a clear and present danger to our troops during wartime. The other basis is when the level of personal and group privacy is so high that the revelation of the information doesn't merit the violation of privacy that would obtain. I mean, I believe it was Justice Douglas in the Griswold v. Connecticut decision of 1965 regarding contraceptives who said that while a right to privacy may not be stated in the Bill of Rights, the First, Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments, maybe Alfred can correct me on this, but that a number of the amendments in the Bill of Rights state the emanation of the penumbra of what's stated in those rights implies a personal right to privacy. Okay, I believe that's the case, and I think we should respect Justice Douglas's wisdom in that regard. Of course,
Andy, a real big question for me is, would it be a threat to national security if you were to uncover the cover-up about the takedown of the Twin Towers building, the Kennedy assassination, and things that involve murder of civilians and unnecessary, wars that we've been dragged into with criminal intent, and it would destabilize a lot of the population? And would that be an excuse for keeping a continued secret or not?
No, that wouldn't create a clear and present danger, nor would it violate individual or group privacy. Those are the kind of things that the people of our country have a right to be told. And so that that's the kind of information that would be brought forward were I to be elected president, or should I say, when I'm elected president. That's the truth policy that I'll implement. Clearly, there's really three areas. There's three areas here. The American people have a right to know political secrets of that nature. Who perpetrated 9/11? If it was the Israeli Mossad, we need to know. If it was a group of Saudi terrorists, as the cover story goes, we have a right to know. If it was a private faction of individuals within the intelligence community or the military, we have a right to know. So political secrets, they have a right to know technical secrets. What has our government accomplished technically? We developed operational teleportation without injury by 1970. The people have a right to know what our own country, our own distinctively American civilization has achieved, especially with their tax dollars. And then they have a right to know about the natural history of the cosmos that we inhabit. So, for example, they have a right to know that when we went to the moon, we found things. We found artifacts from the previous, the pre-Atlantean, the antediluvian civilization that reached the moon and Mars and other celestial bodies in our solar system. They have a right to know that Mars is inhabited and harbors several species of humanoid life, that American astronauts have been going to Mars at least as early as 1964. So those are really the three areas: political truths, technical, and cosmological truths. I believe are part of the common heritage of humankind, and they're certainly the birthright of all Americans, and I will disclose all other secrets, and certainly the secrets that fall in, that don't present a clear and present danger or don't violate privacy. And I mean closely held privacy, like the information that the FBI learns about people's private lives while conducting a criminal investigation. None of us needs to know that. It doesn't go to our national or group interest in any way. It's just gossip. Okay, so I don't want to just open the doors to everything the government is holding being released, but where that test is met, I think it's critical that we do have transparency in those three areas.
Thank you. I'm really glad to hear.
So certainly I would. Yeah.
So, Alfred, we want to give you a voice here as well. What would you like to talk about right now? On our list, we have, Alfred, you're going to talk about Obama being pre-identified and told in 1971. But go ahead and talk about what you feel is relevant in this moment. That or whatever you want to discuss.
Well, I think that the program is going exactly as it should, and that is that we have an historic intervention in this election, and that is by a candidate that has been pre-identified, that we have reasonable evidence has been pre-identified by project-pegasus, by U.S. government time travel, and that's true of all of the presidents since Carter, since Bush Sr., and it's Andy, and he's now making a public intervention as a candidate in 2016. So what we want to do is almost run two tracks simultaneously in the campaign. One track is the actual running of the campaign, and then a parallel track is an observational track which points out to the supporters of the campaign and to all of the citizens and the rest of the world that watching the campaign, what exactly is at stake. And that is that the American electoral system, because of the invention of a new technology and its secret application as an intelligence technology to a constitutional function, which is presidential elections, that constitutional function has become compromised. And so that this as well as a public education effort and as an effort to reestablish the constitutional legitimacy of a presidential election that has been secretly compromised by one branch, namely the executive branch, control of secret technologies that allows the future outcome of an election to be known and allows the winners to be secretly told and, in effect, favored by the government. So it's almost like a Greek chorus,
Right.
where we're so there are citizens that are participating in Andy's campaign at multiple levels here to be able to answer questions, to point things out, and to make observations, and to ask questions of the candidate, and to elicit interests in the electorate in this new dimension of elections, which they probably are unaware of and may think insane, may think crazy, may think really interesting in the way that the movie Back to the Future was really interesting, may begin to wonder why things like the Illuminati cards or things like Donald Trump showing up in cartoons in 2016 as in the year 2000 as a presidential candidate making his entrance into the foyer of the Trump Towers in exactly the fashion that he did so in June of 2016. Why would he do that? How could he do that? How could the cartoon characters know that? Was that leaked material or not?
Yeah, were Trump or Clinton told that they were going to be future presidents as well? It makes you wonder, huh?
Well, we have an eyewitness here, I believe, in the sense that Andy has reported that he was present, I believe, to Bill Clinton being briefed. Is that the case, Andy?
Well, let me just track what happened regarding the individuals that have already been elected president, and then I can give some additional insight into Hillary, at least what I think happened regarding communications between Hillary Rodham prior to even going to Yale Law School and my late father. So let me just track that. As Alfred pointed out, when I described how I was invited during the 1970-71 timeframe to one luncheon of Project Pegasus personnel, a great many of them, we were at like 4 or 5 tables at a restaurant in Albuquerque. That's when Bush 41 and 43 were present, and Barbara Bush, the wife of George H.W. Bush, the mother of George W. Bush. And that's where W was going around from table to table, and he got right in front of me. I was about 9. He was 24, 25 years old, just out of college. And that's when he said, "Andy, have you heard my daddy and I are going to be president?" Now, I wasn't present at the actual briefing, but I was present in the wake of that briefing where George W., being only in his mid-20s, was still sort of under the emotional suasion of having just been informed, or having recently been informed, that not only his father but he were both going to reach the White House. And he clearly was processing what he had been told. He may have been told right there, or he was just bringing that up because he was now in the company of the actual government project that recovered that information from the quantum hologram. But anyway, that's what he was saying. Now, there was a much smaller group meeting before or after that. I can't 40 years later, I really don't know. But so shortly before or after that, there was a much smaller meeting at lunch in one of their favorite restaurants, Project People's restaurants somewhere in New Mexico. I think it was probably Old Town Albuquerque. It was, again, probably the La Hacienda or La Placida restaurant there in Old Town Albuquerque, which were the two most popular Mexican restaurants in all of New Mexico in those years. So guests of honor were always brought there. Bill Clinton was very young Bill Clinton was sitting on my left. I remember he came to the table early. And then across from me was Dr. Harold M. Agnew, the director of the Los Alamos Labs. On Harold's left was Dr. Ivan Browning, who was then serving as the director of science and technology for the CIA. And my late father, Raymond F. Basiago, and Joe Conason, both of the Ralph M. Parsons Company CIA nexus, rounded out the small group that was there with us at lunch. And Bill Clinton said something to the effect, and this is almost verbatim, one of the reasons I was selected as a time traveler for Pegasus was my eidetic memory for both visual scenes and written information, and for things people said and did. I was able to report back very accurately what had transpired. So what transpired at that lunch table was Bill Clinton said something like, well, you know, fellas, I know that you all work for the atomic research community, and I know that you're always doing amazing things and building more destructive nuclear warheads and so forth. But some mornings I get up and I look at myself in the mirror and I have to pinch myself, and I say to myself, me, Bill Clinton, President of the United States? Well, fellas, that dog don't hunt. Okay, now that means that Clinton, I kind of tried to lay off the Arkansas accent a little bit on that telling, but so Clinton was at that lunch with literally the federal science administrator of Project Pegasus, Harold Agnew, who had been present at all three critical phases of the Manhattan Project. He had been in the squash courts at the University of Chicago when they did CP1, when the atomic pile went critical. He was actually manipulating one of the graphite rods to prevent an explosion as the prized physics pupil of Dr. Enrico Fermi. He was in Los Alamos and at Alamogordo when the bomb was designed and manufactured and tested, and he actually calibrated the Hiroshima blast following the Enola Gay piloted by Captain Paul Tibbets of the U.S. Air Force in a chase plane called the Great Artiste during the dropping of the first atomic weapon of war on Hiroshima, Japan. So Harold was, in a sense, the quintessential Manhattan Project physicist. And here he is, you know, I'm sitting with a Bill Clinton who hadn't even yet grown a beard as an activist in the anti-war movement. It was a skinny boy Clinton, okay, who was there with us at lunch. Now, that's what I learned of the future presidents Bush, and Clinton as a result of sharing lunch with them. Alfred, to his credit, did some lateral thinking and said, well, wait a minute, Andy. How many, your 1961 birth year, wasn't that the largest cohort in U.S. history? And I said, yes. And he said, well, wait a minute. That means that there was one American boy born in 1961 who was invited to those lunches, and it was you. Maybe you were invited because you were a future president. And while they hadn't yet told you were going to be president, they were still subjecting you to the educative function of meeting three future presidents and seeing that they were ordinary human beings before you would be told later in your young life that you were going to be president. And that was during our Mars jump room training in the summer of 1980. Both Barack Obama, then using the name Barry Soetoro, and I were notified that summer that we were future presidents. So that's what we know. I wasn't told when I would win. I wasn't told whether I would be directly elected or succeed to office under the 22nd Amendment as vice president or Speaker of the House or Secretary of State or what have you. And I wasn't told when. All I was told by my late father was that I was going to be president after Barry reached the White House. He said, Barry's going to reach the White House in his late 40s, and obviously you two are contemporaries. This, in fact, was when we had dropped Barry off at the Hoopa Indian Reservation, where there's a small airstrip that at least then was flying small commuter craft to Portland International Airport because Barry was temporarily leaving our training program to go visit his grandparents in Hawaii and take a break. So my father drove the two of us from Weed, California, where College of the Siskiyous is located, where our training program was being held, up to the Hoopa Indian Reservation. And I remember him being very nervous behind the wheel. He was actually clutching the wheel at 2 and 10, making sure that he didn't err. And I now realize he was so uptight during that trip because he had two future presidents at age 19, or 18 and 19, sitting in the car with him. And then on the way back, after we dropped Barry, as we knew Barack Obama as Barry Soetoro, off at the Hoopa airstrip there, driving back to Weed, I said, "Dad, do I really become president?" And he said yes. And then he told me how Barry would reach the presidency in his late 40s, and I would be elected sometime later. But he didn't tell me what year I would be elected. And it's unclear whether he was communicating to me the age of life I would be when I would reach the White House. So I'm not sharing that information because I don't want to create confusion about the story. So then looking at the meeting between Stanley Ann Dunham, the putative mother of Barack Obama, who the finding by British intelligence that he was not her biological son indicates that she in fact was his adoptive mother. But examining the meeting that she set up between her former classmate at the University of Hawaii, Barack Obama II, and a young Barry Soetoro, Alfred, again utilizing his gift at lateral thinking, said, wait a minute. If you were in lunches with the Bushes in one setting and then Bill Clinton in another in 71, and the meeting at the Honolulu airport took part in 71, we can at least extrapolate that it's reasonable to conclude that Barack Obama may have been told as early as 1971 that he was a future president. But I just want to emphasize in this broadcast that I don't know whether that's the case. He may have just been thrown together with his putative father because they were going to engineer the Barack Obama cover story to try to convert the adoptive son of Stanley Ann Dunham into her progeny, namely to establish that Barack Obama was born of an American mother in Hawaii with his foreign exchange student father from Kenya, simply because Barack Obama is the son of neither of them, and in all likelihood is the illegitimate son of Muhammad Subud Sumo Wadi Hadjojo, the Muslim founder of the Subud sect in Indonesia, which is kind of a splinter group of Islam that synthesized beliefs from a number of other major world religions into its belief system. And certainly when I walked into the room we were sharing in summer of 80 and Barry was praying to Mecca, he revealed to me not only that he was a Muslim, but that he was an adherent to the Subud sect within Islam. And when we look at the great involvement of his adoptive mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, in the Subud movement, both in not just both, but in Indonesia, Hawaii, and the mainland. And we look at the finding that MI6 made that he is not her biological son. And we also examine the fact that Loretta Fuddy, the woman who released the fictitious, the fallacious certificate of live birth, the one that had all those photoshopped corrections, she had been the international social director for Subud from 2006 to 2008, the very year that Barry Soetoro was elected president as Barack Obama. So we have this lifelong involvement of President Obama in the Subud movement. So when I listened tonight to Alex Jones claiming that he's even in touch with Secret Service, who are revealing that Barack Obama is a Muslim infiltrator and a foreign national infiltrator of the presidency, all of these little things I learned about him when we were in training in 1980 start to make much more sense. But anyway, Alfred indicated that, well, look, if you're meeting with the Bushes and Clinton in 71, he's being introduced to the man that the CIA was then going to use to run the legend that he was a natural-born citizen. Maybe Obama was told as early as 71. I don't know that, but it's certainly a reasonable conjecture. But certainly I can say through direct evidence, the evidence of my own life experience, that in the summer of 1980, while being trained by the CIA to go to Mars via this revolutionary jump room technology that had been engineered in a joint venture between Parsons and Lockheed, possibly based on either recovered extraterrestrial technology or jump room technology that had been given to our government by one of the many gray extraterrestrial species. It looks like we can certainly say that Obama and I had an awareness by 1980. Even if I ended up forgetting that I'd even been told, but certainly it was intended by the people running that program to make us aware of our destinies as president. We can only speculate as to why they endangered the lives of two future presidents in involving us in something like going to Mars. But I think they may have actually selected us because they knew we were going to survive and become president, and therefore they could limit some of their losses in the jump room program and also prepare us for the stresses and strains of being president. So that's the actual story. But look at the situation I was put in. I could do what Carter, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama did, and that is conceal their prior knowledge of their presidencies to secure an electoral advantage, but in the process violate basic morality and the oath of attorney that I took to uphold the U.S. Constitution, or I could reveal that I had served in the jump room program and that it was in that context that Obama and I were notified of our future presidencies. At least in his case, maybe it was reinforced during that summer. In my case, it's when I learned that I was a future president. But I couldn't do that because I felt an obligation to the truth and to my fellow citizens. And so I came forward. But when I came forward and revealed not only my involvement in time travel and Project Pegasus, but then my involvement in the Mars jump room program and all these presidential complications, it made explaining who I am to the American people that much more difficult. But from my perspective, I had no other choice. Now, I decided to come forward even if it cost me the presidency, even, let's say, this election. But I have confidence that it ultimately won't cost me the presidency, because when you identify a future event utilizing technology by, for example, teleporting people to the future or propagating a standing hologram of a future event with the devices that they were calling chronovisors, these electro-optical devices that propagated holograms of future events, the future event that you're at quantum accessing is the sum total of all previous relevant and affecting causes. And so if they were projecting my future in 1980, that meant that then they could see what was going to happen without variation when it does happen, because that moment they were accessing is going to be the sum total of all future causes. So I'm confident that ultimately it won't cost me the presidency, but certainly in practical terms it complicates the process of running. But what were my options?
You know, Andy, it seems that you don't necessarily have to wait till next time. That my mind was blown when I understood you had a plan for a write-in campaign that could actually make you the president this round. Could you explain how that works?
Yeah, that's something that's kept back from the American people. 43 of the 50 states, with the exception of Hawaii, Nevada, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, allow write-in votes to be cast for president. So even without a major party nomination, as long as I stay in the race, there is a mathematical possibility that I will be the first U.S. president to be elected without a major party nomination since George Washington. Ironically, the first president that I met as a child serving on Project Pegasus. I met Washington in August of 1776 in his encampment at Brooklyn Heights, where I was instructed by the program to alert him of the urgent military necessity to retreat his troops from New York Harbor, which he did. So Pegasus was actually enmeshed in the revolutionary success during the Revolutionary War.
Wow.
And the creation of the United States of America as a country. But yes, I'm running as a write-in pretty much because we found when we organized Andy 2016 last year, about a year ago, officially with my campaign manager, Duke Brickhouse, who's a lawyer in Virginia, and Karen Del Kinnison, the writer, who's my chief of staff and chief speechwriter, that it was going to cost us $4 to $5 million to get ballot access. And just like the creation of the political parties, that is a completely extra constitutional embellishment of the way we were supposed to elect our chief executive. There's nowhere in the Constitution are the major parties or minor parties mentioned. In fact, if you read the Federalist Papers, there's a discourse, I believe by Alexander Hamilton, it may have been John Jay, about the fact that the form of constitutional government we were seeking was one in which faction would be discouraged. Faction are combinations of groups of citizens at the expense of all the people. And here we have faction institutionalized in the Republican and Democratic parties. I mean, these 19 people who are being palmed off as the candidates all the time to the American people are only being palmed off because they have the immediate sponsorship of the two major parties in running for president and all of the funding. So we're really in an evil situation here in terms of electing our presidents. And so I'm confronting both of those extra constitutional aberrations and digressions from the constitutional pattern that was decided back in 1787 of how we would elect our president by running as an independent without major party support and running a write-in candidacy. And it's this year in which I'm going to be taking that case to the American people with a stepped-up campaign of YouTubes and of social media postings and seek to throw the switch and overwhelm the non-constitutional nightmare that we find ourselves in, when even somebody who's not qualified under Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5, the natural-born citizen clause, namely Ted Cruz, is actually being described as one of the front runners in the Republican nomination process. Ted Cruz is not qualified to be president because the standard that was placed in the Constitution at Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5 was the phraseology of natural-born citizen, which is from a work of law that was entitled The Law of Nations, that was written by a Frenchman named Vattel, V-A-T-T-E-L, and published in 1756. So 25 years later, it was inspiring the framers to include it as the standard of citizenship to run for president. The original standard was a two-part standard of born in the country and secondarily of two parents who were themselves citizens. Okay, now over time, as a result of dilution by the U.S. courts, the standard now for citizenship is born in the country. That's why we have anchor babies. You know, a Mexican family can come across the U.S.-Mexican border, have a child in San Diego, and that child is an American citizen as a result of that birth in the country. Unfortunately for Mr. Cruz, for Senator Cruz, he doesn't qualify under the diluted standard for natural-born citizen. His supporters are now saying, wait a minute, he's a citizen because his Cuban mother, his ethnically Cuban mother, was born in Delaware, and so it doesn't matter that he was born in Canada of a Cuban-born father and an American-born mother. But it does, because actually, when you don't refer to what country the parents were born in, the determining test of citizenship is, were you born in the country? So it's irrelevant that one of Ted Cruz's parents was Cuban-born and the other was American-born. Let's even cede him that advantage and say, okay, your mom, we're going to believe you that your mom was born in Delaware. We mean no disrespect. You were born of an American mom. That's true. But if you're admitting that they were born in Canada, then you don't satisfy the minimal test, the diluted test of what it means to be natural born. So my point here is not to isolate Ted Cruz as an Hispanic American. He's actually a very distinguished person, a graduate of Harvard Law School, a senator from Texas, and I honor and value that. I admire his accomplishments. He's an intelligent man, but he's not qualified under the U.S. Constitution to be president of this country. It's just not in his cards, because he was not born in the country. And so here we have this mass media-driven presidential process permitting a a disqualified person from not only being held out as a major party candidate, but being spoken of as a front runner or as one of the leading Republican candidates. I'm sorry, but that's just a sacrilege. That goes against the express terms, both the express terms of the Constitution, if you take a strict constructionist view of the Constitution, but if you take a more activist liberal reading of the Constitution, what the courts have activistically done to the natural born citizen standard is basically water it down to one qualifying clause, and that is that you be born in the country. So because he was not born in the country, Ted Cruz is simply not qualified constitutionally to be president. So that's the mediocrity that's been injected into the system, not Mr. Cruz necessarily, but the mediocrity of his candidacy embodied in the fact that somebody who is not qualified to be president is being held out as a leading candidate.
We have about 5 minutes before the first break, so I want to focus on some of these questions you sent us and talking points. So how do you view the flawed nature of the major candidates, Trump, Clinton, Bush, and Sanders?
Okay. First of all, let's isolate Trump. Trump has purchased most of his airtime.
No, Andy, that's not true. Trump, Trump, in fact, stated that he was very embarrassed because he's $35 million under budget, has purchased no airtime because he's getting it all for free. And
I was told by Democratic Party activists in L.A. that there was bribery involved, but I'll take your word for it.
I haven't seen that, but he is contemplating his first formal purchase of airtime of $2 million in the upcoming Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina primaries.
Okay, I think that Trump will be denied the Republican nomination because he's not electable, because he's already alienated Hispanics, women, and blacks, and those are major voting blocs. Second, he's simply not an appealing person. When was the last time that a presidential candidate had their hairstyle made fun of? I think that's somewhat of a projection of the fact that Donald Trump rubs people the wrong way as essentially a brash New Yorker. He's a creature of New York City. Third, he obtained great wealth in the United States primarily by lying to state of New York and city of New York regulatory officials in terms of what his development projects would do and what they would achieve. He lied in terms of the impacts of his projects, the quality of the manufacture, and their financial viability. He has been married multiple times, basically as a serial womanizer as a husband, rejecting the bride of his youth, rejecting his second spouse, who was no less a woman than his first wife, and now he's married to a woman half his age from Eastern Europe, basically, I hate to say it, but a catalog bride from Eastern Europe. I just think he has negatives that haven't really been considered because he's riding a burst of popularity as the first candidate to speak his mind. I don't think he's a truth candidate because he's not speaking to the issues that are of importance to the truth movement, but I think he's been a truthful candidate in the sense that he's not necessarily censoring himself, and that's won a lot of immediate notoriety. But I do not see him retaining his popularity because it's already clear that he's an active negative personality. We know he's active negative because he criticizes groups of people, for example, Hispanic Americans, who are essentially one of the most, if not the most, culturally, socially, and economically dynamic groups of Americans. He's indicating a mass deportation of 9 million Hispanic Americans that would cost $150 billion, which is crazy. He's talking about placing a wall along our 1,500-mile border with Mexico, a country that's been contributing to our economic development since the 1880s, when the rail lines were built into northern Mexico and the migrate, work, and return pattern of immigration began among Mexican individuals and families. This man is literally somebody worth $10 billion who doesn't understand that Hispanic immigration in the United States has actually been one of the things that has allowed us to economically adapt to the fact that we're an aging country. The metaphor that I like to use is, wait a minute, try to curb your bigotry here, Mr. Trump. That Mexican-American kid working, passing you your Whopper through the window at Burger King, we need him to keep that Burger King franchise running, okay? In other words, we need the workers that we've been absorbing. Otherwise, there would be mass unemployment among Anglos, for example, and there isn't. There may be some angry talk among Anglos that they're constantly being told they're overqualified or they're losing a job, canning groceries at their local Winco to Hispanic workers. But the bottom line is that Hispanic workers and migrants to this country are sustaining us economically. And here's a billionaire who doesn't get that. So my take on Trump is he's active negative. He's antagonized specific groups of voters. And he will not remain as popular as he has been. In fact, he will not get the Republican nomination.
Wow, that went fast. We're at the top of the hour on first break, and back in to cover 100 principles.
Radio at freedomslips.com. We'll be right back after this message.
Tune in Tuesdays at 12 noon Eastern on Studio A to hear Tammy Adams share her knowledge of an unknown realm on Talking with Your Angels. Join Tammy as she uncovers hidden secrets about the spiritual world of angels, ghosts, and other entities that have been with us longer than we know. Tammy is a psychic, a teacher, spiritual coach, a leader in her field, and will be sharing her information and stories with you. So join us on Tuesdays at noon on Studio A. With Tammy's guidance, you'll find out who has been watching over you from the other side, and soon you will be talking with your angels.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Aloha, everyone, and welcome back to the Sacred Matrix on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com with your hosts, Janet Kara Lesson and Dr. Sasha Lesson. And we're here today with presidential candidate Andrew-d-Basiago and our dear friend Alfred Lambermont Webre. And it's obvious we're going to need to do another show. But before we get back to our show, I'd like to remind everybody to please go over to that donation button and make your donation of $1, $10, $15, $20, whatever you can afford. Would be greatly appreciated. And we do thank you very much for your donations, which allow Revolution Radio to bring shows like this to you, our devoted listeners. So thank you very much for your donation, and sorry for the noise the coffee maker is making. So, Alfred and Andy, we're going to have you back for a series of shows because this is such an important issue, the presidential campaign. It sets a tone for the rest of the world for 4 more years or longer. And what did you want to say? You want to go into the?
I was going through I was going through the 4 major candidates as identified by the mass media. So we were at Hillary Clinton.
Right.
Yes.
May I proceed?
Continue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hillary is very intelligent. She's very experienced, but she's not popular. And I'll even grant her this. I think one of the reasons Hillary is not popular is her accent. She basically has an educated person's Chicago accent. It's a very grinding dialect or accent in the United States. And I say that because when you read what Hillary Clinton has said, her pronouncements are far less irritating. In fact, they're sort of moderate. But when you hear her communicate, there's a kind of an oppressive quality to the way she speaks. The second reason I believe that the second thing I would note about Hillary is the information about Hillary not being in control of her personal emotion, her propensity to lash out, to be argumentative, to lack sort of personal virtue. You know, the injuries that occurred to Secret Service agents from thrown glass ashtrays when she was First Lady are going to haunt her. But the number one negative that Hillary has is that she is married to America's leading unregistered sex offender. The rapist known as William Jefferson Clinton. The information about President Clinton's lifelong pattern of forcible rape has been revealed by Roger Stone in a new book, and could foment into a wider investigation into Bill Clinton's pedophilia in the Caribbean readout of a close personal friend of his. So the Clinton sex scandal of the 1990s is going to reverberate and return in Hillary's campaign later this year, but it's not going to deny her the Democratic nomination. She's going to get the Democratic nomination. Now, I believe the Republicans are going to nominate – they would be smart to nominate Bush and Pataki as large state governors in either order, either Pataki-Bush or Bush-Pataki. Given the capture of the Republican Party by financial interests, I think it's almost certainly going to be a nomination of Jeb Bush. And if he was smart, he would select Pataki as his running mate, because he could say, look, we governed Florida and New York. I would also add that of my competitors, I have the most respect for Governor Pataki, especially because he is the most experienced politician or governmental leader at all levels. He worked his way up through local politics.
Yeah, Andy, sorry. Pataki dropped out yesterday.
Okay, well, he still might not be denied the vice presidential nomination.
Right.
In fact, maybe that was a backroom deal with Bush. He wasn't doing that well in the polls, but I would certainly view a Bush-Pataki ticket as a strong one. Now, the reason that Bush is not electable is the history of his father and brother of involving the country in war and in economic recession. Most people agree we do not need another Bush in the White House. You know, when you've had tuberculosis and cancer, you don't need malaria. So I don't think that Bush is going to win if he is nominated. I don't think it's going to be any of the Johnny-come-latelys in the Republican Party. I think they are going to nominate Bush, because I think the Republican Party is a controlled party. That leaves Bernie Sanders in his race against Hillary for the Democratic nomination. I think that based on what I've learned from Sanders organizers, the Democratic National Convention is pretty much going to be a coronation of Hillary Clinton. My take on Sanders is I think that his views most align with mine. He is clearly a lefty. But what I find strange about Sanders is, for everything we know about somebody who would describe themselves as a social democrat, I'm sure that not just Sanders, but a Ralph Nader would identify himself as a social democrat. Sanders nonetheless supports the prosecution of Edward Snowden. For my part, I've pledged to bestow upon Mr. Snowden the Presidential Medal of Freedom for serving the people of this country in making us aware of the fact that all of our electronic communications were being intercepted by the National Security Agency. I find it strange that Sanders supports the interests of the intelligence community and the cryptocracy in holding out for the prosecution of Snowden. And that makes me wonder, like Clinton, that is to say William Jefferson Clinton, and like Barack Hussein Obama, is Sanders another operative on the left for the CIA who was profiled as a leftist to be dropped into leftist circles, to infiltrate those circles, to report back, to commit basically espionage, both overseas and domestically, regarding, in Clinton's case, the anti-war movement, in Obama's case, the Pan-African movement? Was Bernie Sanders dropped into leftist political circles in the United States as an avowed socialist from Vermont because he, in fact, is a lifelong CIA agent? I'm tending to suspect that may be the case with Sanders. But the bottom line is, look, even if we were to grant his major premise that he's a democratic socialist, or a social democrat, if you will, which are really antagonistic terms because democratic capitalism is actually the political economy of the Democrat, not the socialist. Socialists, for example, support the collectivization of property, which is certainly not very democratic. But I think that Sanders cannot win the Democratic nomination because the Democratic Party is Republican light. I mean, for every supporter of a Ralph Nader or a Bernie Sanders, you have 19 delegates who are looking for somebody like Hillary who supports the banks and the corporations the same way a Republican does, but has some liberal conceits, like let's say in terms of policies regarding women, civil rights, and the environment, but basically still does the bidding of banks and corporations. In fact, somebody published the leading donations to Hillary Rodham Clinton, and they were all like 10 times the size of all the union contributions to Sanders, and they were all from banks and corporations. She's pulling down $200,000 speaking fees from corporations and special interests. Sanders is pulling down 1/10 of the scale of those donations from unions. So I cannot see somebody as far left as Sanders getting the nomination. He'll get a lot of support from Hollywood because it will still be fashionable to have supported Sanders in his failed quest to make the Democratic Party ethical. But one of the problems of our two-party system is that we really at this point only have one party, the conservative and quasi-liberal faction of the parties in power, the Republicans and the Democrats. And I just can't see somebody who describes himself as a social democrat winning the Democratic nomination. So that's my analysis of the four of who are described as the two leading candidates of the Republican and Democratic parties.
Okay, Sash wants to ask something, and I want to ask something. So
yeah, well, since so much of what you are offering the country has to do with your experiences with transporter technology, with the chronovisor, with time travel, I wish you would just give at least a capsule idea of just what are these terms referring to, and how would they benefit us?
Well, basically, in Project Pegasus, there were 8 modalities of time travel that were researched and developed. But the two leading technologies, the ones with the most relevance to the future and the ones we were doing the most, were we were moving back and forth across the country via Tesla teleporters, which open up vortal tunnels, or interstitial chasms, as it were, in the fabric of time-space itself. So we were jumping through a Tesla device, a double parenthesis-shaped Tesla device in Woodridge, New Jersey, entering a tunnel in time-space that was sort of a bluish white color with, if you look to the sides, you could see events going on holographically in the wall of the tunnel. And then when the tunnel closed, we were elsewhere in the country. We were 2,005 miles west in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The implication of that is that, I beg your pardon? Hello?
I didn't say anything.
Oh, I heard some crosstalk. Yeah, I heard some crosstalk by somebody not present on my headset here. So that must be our listeners from the NSA. So where is Snowden when you need him, right? So the significance of that is that from 1970, we could have been living in a world in which, let's say, somebody in London, England, could have jumped to Sydney, Australia, not aboard a commercial passenger plane that would take 24 hours to reach the Antipodes, but in seconds. Also, right. When I was on the project, they learned how to manipulate the device itself So we were being delivered upon teleporting across the country either before or after the time we had jumped through the device. In other words, the Tesla teleporter became a time travel device, a time machine. The devices called chronovisors, which have more lately entered the time travel literature as looking glass devices, they were never called that. They were always known as chronovisors when I was serving on the project from the fall of 1969 to the end of the summer of 1972. Basically originally they had been TV-like screens, but after Fermi joined Ernetti and Gemelli in Italy and developed the two-dimensional chronovisor. When the Vatican, however, gave the chronovisor technology to the U.S. Defense Department, at Bell Labs they were worked into standing holograms. Wow. So that if you looked at the hologram, you could see a past or a future event going on. But if you stood in the hologram as it was enveloped around you, you subjectively experienced going to that past or future event just because of the theory of relativity. Just relativistically, the past or future was brought into the laboratory and you went to the past or future as a result of being inside that hologram. Now, we don't want to introduce – I'm calling for the declassification and deployment of Tesla teleportation in a public-private partnership that would be administered like airports are, where the United States would construct teleports around the world and then begin filling in at the more micro scale so that we're living in the kind of 20, 45, 30 years from now that I visited when I was a child on Project Pegasus. It was a 2045 where teleport stations, basically teleports, were as commonplace as bus stops and elevator landings are in any city in the United States today. Okay, so you can just walk out of your neighborhood.
Beaming into your living room.
Well, they would have a controlled set of arrival points. So just as you can control where somebody gets on or off of a bus, you could construct the technology so that, for example, all of no matter how convenient the teleports were to jump through the device or sit in a car-like vehicle inside a plane-like sort of seating arrangement inside the teleport, you would only arrive in a standard location that was not somebody's living room, but was, a standardized teleport arrival area so that nobody's privacy was violated. Now, if we do that,
what about Swerdlow and others have talked about at least the earlier versions of people being lost or injured or never coming back. Is there any danger like that?
Theoretically, there is, but let me just say that the Montauk subculture has propagated a lot of scary information about time travel or creepy information, I think, as a disincentive for it being adopted and people adopting it. My experience in Pegasus certainly involves some horrific events, like one boy losing his feet, a girl going teleporting to Santa Fe. By the way, we now have the location of that jump. It was to the Leah Harvey Junior High School grounds when it was under redevelopment. Because I'd asked my dad about Lee Harvey Oswald when we went past the sign as we were driving out. So I continue to do my memory work on my experiences. In the case of Chronovision, so I would say that, yes, there was always a danger that we would be lost in time-space, or that we would, let's say, asphyxiate if the tunnel was too long and we ran out of air. But the teleportee of the future is going to be sitting inside of a little self-contained vehicle modeled on some of the seating within a commercial passenger plane. I call them VORTs, which is an acronym for Vehicles of Recumbent Teleportation. In other words, they're going to have a little car they're going to be sitting in rather than undergo the vagaries of literally being unprotected from the Vortal tunnel itself, as we were when we were developing teleportation. Now, if we do that and eliminate all other forms of transport that rely on the internal combustion engine, we're going to be able to eliminate 60% of the greenhouse gases that is the human industrial contribution to global warming. 60%, which is huge. It'll be more than a half solution. On the side of the chronovisors, we can't permit universal chronovision, because that would destroy personal and group privacy. What we want to do, though, is we want to initiate a new era of science and education and public culture in the United States by placing chronovized images at virtual museums and libraries at the federal capital and at the state capitals and urban metropolitan level and at the state level. In other words, we want to give American school children the opportunity to literally see past events. Like, imagine the spectacle of Washington laying the cornerstone to our nation's capital on September 18th of 1793 in his Masonic regalia with his fellow Freemasons. Those are images that none of us have seen because they occurred before the advent of still and motion picture cameras. We're going to be able to go back all the way to primordial time in showing young people the way that the world evolved, and that will give them an appreciation for how far we've gone, and also some desire to contribute to our future development by just seeing how lucky they are living, let's say, in New York City today, rather than the conditions that existed in New York City around 1900, in which even bearing the smell of New York City in 1900 was a difficult thing because of the human and animal waste in the streets. Okay, I know because I was sent there. It was horrific. So we're going to be able to spark a revolution in awareness, not just among children, school children, but adults, by having images that have been gathered holographically from the quantum hologram displayed in virtual museums and libraries. And but yet we can't introduce it. We'd have to have some policing of independent chronovision, or then factions of people could begin becoming very wealthy or manipulative of others, or suppressing other people's exercise of their rights and so forth, if they had the advantage of seeing, for example, future events after bootlegging their own chronovisors. So we're going to have to shut down independent chronovision, but we want to use a kind of a public-private foundation to put specific images of past events in the public domain. That would be Abraham Lincoln, for example, giving the Gettysburg Address, or his address at Cooper's Union, let's say his House Divided speech, not Lincoln making love to his wife, or, taking his last trip to the Privy. We want to have some discretion in terms of what we show regarding even long dead past human beings on Earth, because I still think they have some inchoate right to privacy even after they've passed, and certainly living and future people have an abiding right to privacy because of the embarrassment that would obtain. So anyway, those were the primary technologies that were developed under Project Pegasus, which could have been introduced in American society by no later than 1970, because they were fully operational in 1970.
We would have a whole different planet. I'm aware how fast time is flying on this show, speaking of time. So I wanted to touch on your 100 proposals that you are going to post, or they are posted on your website and will be disseminated on social media.
They will be.
So give us some of them. I know one listener wanted to know about, let me get that question, basic minimum income. But what would you like to share? Give us some teasers for your.
I'll give you one of the objectionable things. Yeah, this goes back. Yeah, this goes back to Clinton Gore, but it's one of the most objectionable things that's occurring that the U.S. government is perpetrating, and that is they are destroying our blue skies. They are making us sick. They are giving us respiratory illnesses. I myself have struggled with respiratory illnesses for 5 years now through the chemtrail spraying. We have pictures on the internet of the canisters inside the spraying planes. We have the reporting of where the chemtrail spraying originated. It originated at a climate change seminar that Dr. Edward Teller participated in, where he recommended the spraying of oxides of barium and aluminum, namely heavy metals, in the troposphere, which is the upper reaches of the atmosphere, to enhance the albedo effect of our planet. The albedo effect is the phenomenon of reflectance back into space of solar radiation, which lowers the heat of the atmosphere and of our planet. Okay, so we know who suggested it. Basically, the father of the thermonuclear weapons, the father of the nuclear bomb, Edward Teller, one of the consulting physicists on Project Pegasus, no less. and it is making us sick, and it was.
What was the purpose of it?
To enhance the albedo, by enhancing the albedo effect to stem global warming, because they were afraid that the Andrew Marshall Pentagon view of global warming might unfold, where with enough global warming, the polar ice caps begin to melt. That makes the saline content of the oceans less heat transmitting between the particles of salt in the ocean. That defeats the Gulf Stream, where warm equatorial waters are brought up to the cold polar waters, and ultimately can result in a cold snap, as developed very well, I thought, by Art Bell and Whitley Strieber in their book, The Coming Global Superstorm. That is the Andrew Marshall scenario that the CIA and the Defense Department has been concerned about since the early 1970s, is a new ice age resulting from global warming. So there's really no point at this point debating whether global warming or global cooling is occurring. What we need to focus on is the fact that the last ice age brought the glaciers down to the southern Kansas border. Now imagine the destruction that would occur. We would lose all of Canada, most of Japan, large sections of China, England and the rest of the United Kingdom, Scandinavia, and the northern United States and northern Russia. Contrary to our belief that the southern hemisphere is overpopulated, 2/3 of humanity lives north of the equator. So the north hemisphere living humans would be squeezed to the land that was left hundreds of miles in front of that southern Kansas border. In other words, it would be advantageous, let's say, to live in Tucson, Arizona, or Mexico, or Venezuela, or Argentina, or Brazil, rather than Minneapolis, St. Paul. Okay, those people would be gone. And I hate to say that to my dear friends like Alfred in the beautiful country and democratic,
Well, yeah. I don't want to jump in here because you're making things, but there are other views of chemtrails that can be presented also in their function as implants and as mini bots and mind control and as agents of artificial intelligence entrainment. But I didn't want to get to get us off track.
Yeah, it's possible that nanobots are being placed in the chemtrails. That's one deviation, or one school of thought that goes beyond mine. The other one is that the substrates that cause Morgellons disease, which are basically these nano robots that were placed in the agricultural, petroleum, and textile areas of the economy, that are creating all these bizarre infections by microorganisms that are ultimately robotic, was another purpose of the chemtrails. So in fact, it may be that those of us with chem flu, such as I've experienced it, are not just having the interiors of our lungs irritated by heavy metals like oxides of barium and aluminum, but actually have had robotic nanoparticles administered to our lungs as a result of just breathing the chemtrails. But look, here's the work for the next president. Whatever combination of those three explanations is valid, it may be all three, in fact. The bottom line is that this was done without the involvement of Congress and without the American people being told. So I have vowed that if elected president, on my first day in office, I will seek out the truth of the chemtrails, and as soon as possible, I will go to the American people in a live broadcast and address the cessation of the chemtrail spraying, unless we find that it was the first explanation and that we'd have a massive ice age if we stopped the spraying. Unless, in other words, it literally was a successful solution, albeit a bad one, to a state of emergency that had to be addressed. If I'm not convinced of that, then I'm going to stop the chemtrail spraying. And by the way, Al Gore was the biggest hypocrite on this, because he said, still in all, it was a stupid idea. He was talking about the chemtrail spraying that was decided upon by the Clinton-Gore administration, not the administration of George W. Bush. So there's equal blame to go around here. But I don't believe we should be living in a country in which our government literally destroys our blue skies by spraying all this junk in our atmosphere, and not even tell us what it's doing. That has the concomitants, the hallmarks of a totalitarian form of government that we don't need or deserve. So that would be one of my proposals.
Yeah. Andy, could I ask you a question?
Sure.
And it's this. You now really came out publicly, I would say, somewhere around the year 2000, and you have been walking this path for about 15 years. And there have been many in positions of leadership and knowledge within the exopolitical and UFO field who have almost gone out of their way to be skeptical or hostile to your disclosures. Many times surprisingly so. However, within the last couple of weeks, we've had some remarkable turnaround. One was a colleague of ours, Dr. Michael Sala, who has been skeptical of your reported experiences as a former chrononaut and Mars explorer, and in the last two parts of a 3-part series, he writes, Andrew-d-Basiago's 2016 presidential campaign opens the door, i.e., it's we're sort of the Pope opening the door to the Vatican's secrets. And he writes, Basiago was identified as a future whistleblower by the CIA and therefore exposed to events, people, and circumstances that would shape and influence his later testimony. This suggests that Basiago's whistleblowing activities are part of a long-term CIA-sanctioned disclosure program, which is based on pre-identifying and grooming future presidents. So that he's officially saying that, yes, there is CIA time travel. Yes, there's a disclosure program going on. There's a pre-identification program on, and Andy Basiago is part of this. Have you had a chance to look at any of Sala's recent?
No, not yet. Let me say that for whatever reason, there are times in our lives when we meet somebody who is just against us, and we don't really, never really find out why. The person may attack us physically, financially, morally, or whatever. From my perspective, what you've just read of Sala is just more personal enmity. He's been attacking me for years.
Oh, you do?
and it's going to be very difficult to explicate why. Let me explain why.
Yeah.
His statements basically take the response. First of all, I wasn't involved in Pegasus or the Mars Jump Room program because I had been pre-identified as a future president. I qualified for it on the one hand through battery of testing, hundreds of tests, physical, intellectual, every way. I was also the son of the chief technical consultant between Parsons and the CIA, the major defense contractor and then the major alphabet intelligence agency in the country, my late father, on Tesla teleportation. So my father brought me in. And I also had been identified as a necessary participant by project people from the future because I was going to be involved and then write the book and lead the effort to adopt teleportation publicly. And what Sala does in his comments is he takes the justified accomplishment of that. In other words, he takes the fair credit that should be given for working on that now at this point, as you say, for 15 years, and as many years as it's going to take into the future, and he puts it in this peculiar context that I was involved in such activities because I was being groomed as president. And see, that was the danger of a wider definition of the prior identification. The prior identification was just, I don't know how to describe it. It was just an incidental aspect of my involvement in both projects. I mean, I was taken to the lunches with the Bushes and the Clintons, and then in a small part, almost a sidebar of the jump room training, Barry and I, there was some discussion of the fact that there were 2 future presidents in the training group, but they were never the emphasis or the raison d'etre for my involvement. So in stating that they were, Sala continues his cowardly pattern of devalorizing both my original service in these 2 programs and then even my run for president, my attempt to bring about Tesla teleportation as a fully adopted, reduced to practice public transport system. And the emphasis is on now giving the CIA credit for who I'd been in the past, who I am now, and who I will be in the future. He's just up to the same. My own personal theory is that my story of a child time traveling and overcoming the vicissitudes of his experiences makes Michael Sala personally threatened. I think he needs to jump out of a plane or seduce a beautiful woman or do something that he needs to do to feel manlier, because he's not feeling it now, and he continues to attack me in this way. His article is simply not accurate. I wasn't included in either program because I was a future president. There's no evidence of that. None. And there's condign evidence that I qualified. For example, when we were being screened, I was able to count back random arrays of numbers to 84 places. I had an eidetic memory that could report back a paragraph of a foreign language that I had never read before to the program administrators. So Sala, here's what's objectionable, though, also about Michael. Let's just assume it's not because of some personal insecurity that he has found this cowardly definition of my life, okay, which I think, again, is grounded in his own sense of inadequacy. What's not honorable about his publications regarding me is he has never interviewed me. It's just like David Wilcock talking about, doing a lecture and showing the time machine in the movie Contact and saying, we think this is what the chronovisors look like, when all he could have done is picked up the phone and called me, and I could have given him a description. Sala has never interviewed me, Alfred. He's never interviewed me. He doesn't even know what I've experienced. But so he took your work and legitimately focusing on the issue of prior notification of the presidents based on quantum access, and he took my past work in the truth movement, and now he's positing a completely inaccurate set of more inaccurate claims about me, which is that I was involved because I was a future president, and that my truth campaign, which I also undertook actually at the risk of my own life, because you may recall I was threatened by the Bush administration not to go forward. He doesn't report that, which has been in your reporting and has been in my public statements on radio and television, but yet he states that that basically my truth campaign has been some CIA release of information, some public limited hangout by the CIA. It hasn't been. It's been a truth campaign by ADB. Okay, that's what it's been. You know that.
So you're saying, So you're saying that your activities when you started around the year 2000, I remember that you called up a whole number of individuals, including myself.
Right, to stay alive, right?
Yeah.
Stay alive.
Yeah, sure. And so you're saying that you undertook a genuine whistleblowing campaign out of your own free will, and that you had broken away from any operational or other relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency or
Yes. In fact, I was never career CIA. I wasn't even paid. My last jump to Mars was in 1984. Then Courtney Hunt contacted me when I was a law student in Portland in spring of '89 and had me fly to Albuquerque and drive to Socorro, New Mexico to participate in an exposure to a magnetic field to fix my location in time-space, because it was believed that I was jumping around and I might, quote-unquote, go into the drink. My father, who was basically career CIA, then died in 1990. When I contacted you and other civil libertarians in 1999-2000 to stay alive and utilizing what I call the Casolaro principle, which is you do the opposite of what Danny Casolaro did. You don't secret your sensitive information. You share it with as many people as possible so you survive your own investigation. That was my outreach to you and others in 1999. I think I called you in early 2000 because I knew of your fine reputation as a civil libertarian. And I told friends and family members and people like yourself, distinguished civil libertarians. And that was to stay alive. And then I gave my first lecture in 2004. I then did radio in 2009 and my first television in 2010. I have had no CIA communication. In fact, I remained in communication with Courtney Hunt until he had a stroke and lost the ability to speak around 2001. So even before I lectured in 2004, my CIA contacts were dead or not able to communicate, and that was namely my father and Courtney Hunt. Okay? My dad was deceased as of January of 90. Courtney had a stroke in 2001 before 9/11, and so I couldn't communicate with him. That was it. So in other words, what I'm saying here is my decision to go forward in 2000 was made when I still could have called Courtney and gotten some information from him. In fact, I called him in 2000 3 times and asked him whether I reached the presidency. Okay? But I wasn't either part of a CIA project and I had nobody to communicate to. That was one of my major beefs about these projects, as they involved gifted and talented people in extraordinary experiences with a great esprit de corps, but then they just pushed everybody off deck like used helicopters off of an aircraft carrier in the South China Sea, and we had nobody to even call if we developed a medical complication, an emotional one, or whatever, a professional one regarding our project experiences. We had nobody to call at CIA or at the Navy or anywhere to even verify that we had been in the projects. That's the true history of my experiences, and yet Sala besmirches me again by now indicating that both my truth campaign and by extension my presidential campaign are like creatures of the CIA, which is nonsense. It's pernicious nonsense. And it's generated by Michael because he has an attitude towards me that is so ungrateful and so prejudicial that he should be ashamed of it. That's my position on Sala. I don't hate him back because I'm a Gandhian. I believe in love. I mean, my heroes are people like Jesus Christ and Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. I do not believe in holding a grudge or hating people. Life is too short and human life is too valuable. And the human personality is too sacred for me to go there. But why he continues to persecute me, he has to give the explanation for that. I don't know why he does this.
Right. Okay. Let me jump over then and ask one of Janet and Sasha's questions, which is what do the psychics, mediums, and astrologers have to say of your election in 2016 or 2020?
Now, this truly is laughable because, for one thing, I've been a lifelong devotee of the paranormal because part of my gifts as a kid was my psychic ability and my precognitive dreaming and that sort of thing. It's very, very interesting. The professional psychics who have let me start with the professional psychics. A number of professional psychics have contacted me just sua sponte over email, especially on Facebook, and have said, it's good that you're running. You're not going to win in 2016. You may even pull out, but you're going to be elected president in 2020. Other psychics, more of an amateur nature, have said, I just met with my tarot card reader, and they said, why aren't you working with Andy on his presidential campaign? He's going to win. Or my husband didn't know who you were, and he just got up this morning in bed and said, the name of our next president is going to be Andrew-d-Basiago, whoever that is. Okay? So that's where the psychic input is going. The second input are the spiritualists, the actual mediums. And I would cite 2 different researchers using the SpiritCom, which is a radio frequency hopper in which random words get generated. And when different mediums using 2 different SpiritCom devices literally asked the spirits on the other side, ostensibly human beings who have lived as we have, who are now on the other side of the veil that we cross when we physically die, they've been asked, give us the name of the next president of the United States, and both of them said Andrew-d-Basiago. And the first one who did it for the psychic, what's his name? Oh, down down in Australia. His name escapes me right now, but he's a very prominent psychic. He asked, and the frequency hopping generated this. It went Andrew-basiago, and then 10 seconds later, another voice went, Daniel, which is my middle name. Okay, so 2 spirit com readings by 2 different gifted psychics have generated my name when those on the other side have been asked for the name of the next American president. So that's what the mediums have told us. Now, here's what the most prominent astrologer basically in the world, at least for political handicapping, told me. As a result of professional connections on my campaign team, we were able to reach the distinguished astrologer, somebody who's done everything in life, from being a Catholic priest to a Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist. He's done everything in the area of religion and spirituality, and that's the distinguished Douglas Gabriel, the husband of Tyler Gabriel, who has a new book out on the divine feminine. And Douglas Gabriel was presented with my natal chart, my birth chart, cold. He didn't even have my gender, okay? And he said, well, this person is a writer. I can see the writing ability and passion. This person has such a sense of justice that he's probably a lawyer by now. Certainly if he's an American man, he's a lawyer by now. And he said, and this is what's really funny, and he started laughing. And we said, what is it, Douglas? And by the way, Douglas was the original idea guy for George Lucas on Star Wars. So there's a timely reference to feature film. He actually invented the concept of a lightsaber, for example. And and he made a lot of the metaphysical references that, to the work of Joseph Campbell and so forth about heroism and so forth, and helped Lucas develop the original Star Wars. He then started laughing. He said, we asked him, why are you laughing? And he said, I don't know how to put it, but this person's chart is such a setup for becoming president of the United States that it's laughable. And he said, and it's going to be a twisty path to the White House. It's going to be more like a professional advancement that Theodore Roosevelt had, where he became vice president and then became president upon the assassination of William McKinley, than just being elected president. So what may happen in 2016 or 2020 is I may be asked to be somebody's vice presidential running mate, and then they will leave the presidency for one of the major reasons, death, disability, impeachment, or resignation. And so that, and by the way, Douglas Gabriel was the astrologer who advised Ronald Reagan to become a Republican, whereupon he was elected governor of California and president of the United States. So that astrologer has basically predicted my presidency as being so patently obvious in my natal chart that it's quote unquote laughable. So I just offer that as some, the parlor game take on my presidency. I think it's kind of funny, but right, because it's all there, except that the amateur psychics have been more keen on my election in 2016, and that's going to take a pretty extraordinary event. I would have to be the beneficiary of something in the nature of a political miracle. But then again, miracles happen. Look at the 1969 New York Mets. So it's going to be a 1969 New York Met type of outcome if I win. But then again, if we have a mass discrediting of the establishment candidates, who are they going to go to? With the exception of those 19, I'm almost the only one who's appearing regularly in media, both mainstream and alternative. So.
Do you think there's a possibility of Obama declaring martial law over some a false flag and continuing his presidency instead of having an election?
That if that happens, then I would become his chief critic. I mean, I've wanted to see him in an orange jumpsuit since he denied that he served in the Mars jump room program and betrayed his comrades and ridiculed me as a secret chrononaut. I mean, if I can indict him on charges of treason and of election fraud, I will certainly try to do so if I'm elected the next president of the United States. I mean, there's no love lost between me and Barry. And that's another thing that Michael Salas should know. I'm so angry at Obama that I'd like to see him in prison. I mean, he was commander-in-chief of the U.S. military when he literally betrayed and ridiculed his co-participants in a secret defense project. I mean, that's a pretty low standard of government, if you ask me. I can't see John F. Kennedy saving himself some embarrassment by ridiculing or denying the service of his PT-109 shipmates. I'm sorry. I can't.
I got to say this, because Andy, I'm a Jew and I love Israel, and I am very unhappy with Obama's treatment of Israel, and I want to know how you're going to stand with Israel.
Well, I recognize that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East and is surrounded by enemies, many of whom have been pledged to drive the Israelis into the sea. But I would just describe the position as being that of I don't know who was reacting to that, but my position is basically that of President Carter. I want to see a two-state solution.
Oh, cat.
Oh, it was the cat? I thought it was somebody protesting my pro-Israeli statement. No, I recognize that Israel is a unique country in that region. They've been major allies of ours, basically exploited by our cryptocracy to infiltrate spies and military operatives into the Middle East and to use for military intelligence to basically go to war with Arab countries there. But at the same time, I think that President Carter's position is the most realistic of a two-state solution with an end to apartheid for the Palestinians. So I'm just using that as a reference because it's such a mess at this point that the only clarity I think we've seen from a major leader, and certainly from any past president, is that of President Jimmy Carter in his book, which is what? Peace, No Palestinian Apartheid, which is a book that I recommend to anybody. It's a really thoughtful treatment of a very complicated subject at this point. I certainly think that, and I want this to be understood as not an anti-Semitic judgment, but I certainly think that to the extent that the Camp David Accords did not originate with Carter, but did originate with a line of American presidents who were not just Gentiles, but Christian men, especially Carter as a born-again Christian, that I'm concerned that if Bernie Sanders gets elected, not that a good guy and a Jewish guy would get elected president, that doesn't concern me. But what concerns me is whether we would be hamstrung in terms of seeking peace in the Middle East by having a president who was Jewish, because then all of the Arab countries might say, well, look, the Americans have sided with the Jews because they even elected one president. I can't see why Sanders and his supporters don't see that as not a form of anti-Semitism, but just realism about the mess that the Middle East already is in. And allow that as being, at least at this point in time, something that should be disqualifying, because let's face it, rather than dropping bombs on the Middle East and blowing off the arms and legs of children to secure our oil supply or to protect Israel, we should really be furthering the Camp David process and seeking peace there. And President Carter was able to do so because he was neither a Jew nor a Muslim, but indeed was a Christian. So I hope that doesn't sound anti-Semitic, because it's not meant in that spirit. It's just a little bit of realism about the Sanders candidacy and how it would be interpreted by the Arab world. I think. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when are we ever going to see a woman? We've got this round, Hillary's not acceptable, and it's going to be actually Billary, how it's panning out.
Yes, we don't want
the wife. It seems to be going backwards as a society in terms of women's rights. I was a child of the 60s, and I saw us going much further back then than we are now. There's something happening, and I'm very concerned about it. How are you going to balance this unbalanced planet when all we get is leaders of the planet being men repeatedly? Very, very few women rise to any standards in business, anywhere.
Well, I certainly can't change that without doing a Bruce Jenner. I'm sorry. I'm running. I have a distinctively Y chromosome. I could select a woman as my running mate, which is certainly, of the 6 or 7 individuals on my short list, half are women for vice president. So I can run with a woman. Maybe that'll help foment change. It didn't really work after Mondale asked Geraldine Ferrara to run with him. Getting back to the psychics, there's a man who swings a pendulum named Jesse Blen in Costa Rica, and he's predicting a victory by, is it Dr. Jill Simon, the Green Party nominee? He's predicting that the next U.S. president will be a woman. So maybe I won't be, and it will be Hillary or Dr. Simon or somebody else. But I mean, so certainly there are women still on my short list for VP, and I may run with one.
Would you pledge to have half your cabinet female?
Yes. I mentioned that in the last broadcast. Yes, that's a way to do what what Janet's calling for is to have equality of opportunity in not just the cabinet positions, but in all departments and agencies. Why not?
Cool.
Yes.
I have that in my staff. I have a male campaign director and a female chief of staff. So
excellent.
I'm already practicing gender neutrality.
What happens with once women get up there, they're actually men they're required to go into their masculine. I think to balance the planet is in a continual state of war is to allow women to be in office and allow women to be women.
I agree.
And there was,
and also women are also seeking more nurturing participation in mass society. Look at somebody like a Jane Goodall. I think she's accomplishing more in protecting non-human species than she could ever do as vice president of the United States, just waiting for the president to die, right?
Right.
So women are doing maybe even the preponderant important work already, because some of these official positions that don't involve the same high level of enlightenment and creativity are already occupied by women, and a lot of the political jobs are less creative. Certainly the vice presidency is. I don't know about the presidency. I think we benefit by having a female in the White House. Maybe that's Hillary. But women are telling me they don't like Hillary. They think that she's too strident and bossy and active negative to be the first female president of the United States.
So the leaders are both active negative. And Sasha has a question. We have 7 minutes left.
One concern about electoral reform and gerrymandering and the terrible voting procedures. And what do you intend to do about elections in the United States?
Well, I want to return to paper ballots because paper ballots cannot be faked. The black box voting scandal only happened because the votes were counted by electrons rather than by people. They were counted by people, but as electrons rather than as paper ballots. I think that we should have mandatory paper ballot voting for federal offices.
Mm-hmm. What about the terrible gerrymandering that virtually assures congressmen will keep returning?
We have to end that. It's also being used to put a major military base in every congressional district so that the House is basically an amen chorus for the military-industrial complex. But doing that would be a major battle during my first term, but it's certainly something that I'll try to bring about. But I must be honest and say, given the capture of the system by career politicians, I'm not sure that that's possible right now.
Yeah.
And career politicians serving the military-industrial complex and the banks and corporations. How do you convince a group of career politicians who represent the capture of the Congress by the military-industrial complex to change their ways?
Right. Okay, we have 5 minutes. What would you like to cover in the remaining 5 minutes? What are the most important things you want to convey to our listeners who are considering voting for you?
Okay, we have to look back on our history, and we have to examine what the highest expression of the presidency has been. And that is how I arrived at my platform, which is captioned in the 3 phrases, the 3 terms indeed, of truth, reform, and innovation. Our greatest presidents have told the truth to us. Not just George Washington admitting that he chopped down the cherry tree, which in fact was an apocryphal story that was used to inculcate generations of young Americans in basic honesty. Although Franklin, a non-president, did in fact develop the phrase, honesty is the best policy. We have to recognize that the highest level of presidential leadership is the kind of honesty that President Kennedy evinced when he went before the American people and informed them of the pressing urgency of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, most military debates never leave the Oval Office. Okay, so I will try to be the truth president and not only embody that personally, but administer the presidency from the position of truth and honesty and disclosure, but also bring about an historic set of disclosures by the president without congressional approval or any need for one in the areas of truth about what's going on in government, what is in terms of political matters, technical matters like what technologies our government has developed and how they might be applied, and then truth about the cosmos we inhabit, in those three major areas. That means ET disclosure. It also means something that Alfred suggested to me, which was to not just govern truthfully, but govern from the point of view of bringing about a permanent process of truth enablement in the government itself, and that is to say a truth and reconciliation process modeled on the South African experiment with truth and reconciliation. In other words, I want to use my first term to inaugurate truth institutions. In the area of reform, we've had not a lot of reform presidents, but those who have attempted it, such as both Roosevelts, have been very effective. And we have to do that in a set of areas that I'll reveal my 100 proposals. What needs to be reformed? Certainly, we have to take a look at lobbying. We have to take a look at term limits, because we do have this permanent cadre of elected officials, and I believe it goes far beyond that. I, in fact, believe that they're all basically de facto agents of the intelligence community and the military-industrial complex because of their need to be so to get reelected. So as president, I have to reveal just how far the intelligence community, for example, has penetrated American culture. I mean, we won the Cold War because we were more like what we accused the former Soviet Union of being, not less like. So a set of my proposals is going to be around, okay, who has permeated the mass media under Operation Mockingbird as agents, for example, of CIA? Was it Richard Helms no, it was not Helms, but it was one of the other DCIs. The one that drowned to death, his name escapes me at this point, who stated that everybody of major significance in the mass media is owned by the CIA. There's a reason that newscasters around the country have been snickering at UFO reports for the last 40 years, and that's because they're implementing the diktat of the Robertson Committee report of 1953 in subjecting claims of extraterrestrial contact to public campaigns involving fear and ridicule, and that's because they themselves have been agents of the Central Intelligence Agency as news people. So I will put, the Dan Rathers and the Michael Salas on the White House website. I will literally inaugurate a process of open source intelligence. I might ask somebody like a Robert D. Steele, who was the Libertarian Party's candidate for president in 2008, who's a former intelligence officer, who has a highly evolved system of open source intelligence thought out, to become my director of central intelligence. But I will out the operatives in exopolitics and the mainstream media who have been so instrumental in keeping our cosmic secrets from us.
Out of time, Andy. We have to have you back. Please stay after we disconnect, and we'll talk about scheduling you for your show. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this week.